Today's episode is brought to you by HERdacity. HERdacity is a nonprofit inspiring confidence in women to achieve their professional goals. For resources, networking opportunities, and a strong community of women, visit HERdacity.org to learn more.
Welcome to HERdacous, a podcast for audacious women. Welcome to HERdacous, the podcast for audacious women looking to make some moves in their career journeys. And HERdacous is one of the tools to help you make those strong career moves. My name is Lorelei Gonzalez, the happy host of this show. And today we're going to be talking about the power and privilege dynamics of microaggressions. To assist us in this incredible conversation, I have an equity expert with years of experience working with the University of Texas at Austin, a certified leadership coach in the field of DEI, and the founder and CEO of her own DEI consulting and coaching practice, Dr. Alejandra Mielke.
Hi, thank you for the introduction, and I'm happy to be here.
I am so happy to have you here. I'd like to start the conversation by asking you to address these concepts, these huge concepts of power and privilege before we jump into discussing microaggressions. Like, lead us in.
Excellent. Thank you. So yes, microaggressions are closely related to power and privilege in terms of who has the power to commit these microaggressions, right? And who has the privilege not to endure these microaggressions. So power and privilege, even if we live under ideals of equality, that all human beings are created equal, and many nations and organizations say they are built on these ideals, the truth is that all individuals have different degrees of power and privilege in our society and within our organizations. And these differences create dangerous power imbalances that can affect people's careers, livelihoods, professions, opportunities. Power allows some individuals to serve as the gatekeepers of resources, knowledge, and opportunities, to be the decision makers. And then privilege allows people different access to these resources.
Okay, so what is power?
So power is defined as the ability to direct and influence behavior, events, and allocation of resources. Power can be seen in many different ways and is generally understood when we start answering questions about who can do something and who cannot do something. For example, who can go to work without worrying too much about what to do with their children? Who can walk at night alone with no worries about safety? Who are the ones making tough decisions, laws, policies in organizations and countries? In most Western societies today, many decisions are still controlled by people with certain backgrounds: over 40, male, white European, heterosexual, and middle class and wealthy people.
Right.
These are the folks who are the top in the pyramid of power.
Okay. People that generally look like a president of the United States.
Exactly. And power has always been a commodity, an asset, something that is valued, required, needed, but also abused. A lot of these things are invisible, all these power relationships, but it's through power dynamics that make power struggles evident. Power dynamics describes how power affects relationships between people. The ways we interact with each other, whether it's at work, in the community, schools, can be easily interpreted by power differentials.
What about privilege?
So privilege comes from being a member of a specific group that has power. So if you're a member of a group that has power, you're going to have certain privilege that not everyone has. So privilege is a societal power, and it's an unearned advantage that comes to you as a member of a specific group. In the US and a lot of the world, the Western world, white, heterosexual, cisgender individuals have primarily been the ones who define the systems that make our society, how we understand society, how we understand norms, from raising a family to working, these norms are created by people in power who are generally, like I said, white, heterosexual, cisgender, male. And that gives you privilege, a lot of privilege in life.
So not necessarily related to the things that you've done or earned, but really just by winning the lottery of being born a certain way in a certain place.
Exactly.
How are the concepts of power and privilege used to exclude and include others.
Human beings have consciously and unconsciously used this power, the power that they have, and the privilege that they have to exclude or include others. So we engage in exclusion behaviors. We use the power and the privilege that we have to exclude people. And we can do that at the macro level.
Mm-hmm.
We can do that through institutions and organizations and through policies, procedures, laws, all those things. And we use the people who have the power, create those, and we can exclude people using those. But we can also exclude people at the micro level. And when we do that, is that when we're talking about microaggressions. Microaggressions are ways that we exclude people at an individual level. In fact, actually, one of the authors who works on microaggressions, Tiffany Jana, calls microaggressions subtle acts of exclusion because they're individual acts where we exclude people in different ways. We tell them, you do not belong here. You are not welcome. You should not be here.
That's an unfortunately great definition of a microaggression.
Exactly, yes. Mm-hmm.
Well, so you led us straight to microaggressions, which is a term I think most of the audience is familiar with. We've been having conversations about this for years. So define it for us so that we are all really clear moving into the rest of this conversation. How would you define a microaggression?
What microaggressions are these subtle verbal, behavioral, or environmental things that are present that deny or make other people, like I said, feel like they don't belong, that you are not supposed to be here, that your existence is not real or is not important. So all these little actions, comments, or things that we see around the world that can push people aside, push people away from the mainstream system. A rude comment might be once in a while, one thing here and there, but a microaggression is they more of a pattern. They happen over and over and over again with a very clear message. Sometimes it's not very clear, but a very clear intention of, like I said, excluding people and putting them aside.
Okay. So kind of habits, long-term built-in habits, both in people and in policies.
Mm-hmm.
How do microaggressions relate to someone's position of power and or privilege?
If you think about it, you think about it in terms, who has the power to do this? Who feels so comfortable in their skin and in their place that they are able to say things that can be hurtful or harmful to others without any worry about the impact, right?
The ramifications.
The ramifications of it. You feel so comfortable in your space, in your skin, in the context where you are, that you feel that power to say whatever you want to say, right? And they're related to privilege because it is a privilege to be going around the world without feeling the need to be prepared to defend yourself from a microaggression, right? Or you are going through life with the privilege of not even worrying about receiving one or being the target of one.
Or even having the consequences of perpetuating those things.
Exactly.
To reiterate here, microaggressions are really harmful, regardless of the ignorance behind them or the intention, right? How does this death by 1,000 cuts really harm folks? How does that impact people on a personal or professional level?
It's important to remember that microaggressions, people who receive microaggressions, they can spend a lot of emotional energy trying to identify and understand the intentions of the sender. It can be exhausting trying to say what was said. Did I interpret it correctly? Did she say what I think she said? What did they mean by this, right? And this is psychological exhaustion of having to deal with these comments over and over again, right? And then you have to start thinking about, okay, what should be my response? What should I do? Should I educate people? Should I just remain quiet? I mean, it's a psychological burden to be having to be dealing with these instances of hate or dislike, and then having to come up with ideas of what to do. It can be very tiring for people. So these microaggressions can also create feelings of self-doubt, frustration, isolation, anxiety, anger, and they can really have a strong impact on performance and work engagement in any kind of workplace. For example, when you have a microaggression about you were hired because you're a person of color, right? And we need to have more representation. So your work here might not be because you're good at what you do. You work here might be, or you could have been hired because you are a person of color. So
I'm filling a quota. They're not here for my skills.
Exactly.
What are the ways that microaggressions can be expressed?
So microaggressions can be expressed verbally, right, with comments or questions that are stigmatizing. They can also be behaviors, actions that people do towards others, right? And they can also be environmental, subtle discrimination that occurs in the form of images that we can see, or in the form of narratives that run in our society, or in movies, or in stories, or in jokes, right? So generally, we can think about those three ways that microaggressions can be expressed.
Alejandra, part of our narrative in this show is that I have to take a break about halfway through. So we will be right back after this sponsor break.
Hi, Barbie here from Moonray, husband and wife indie pop duo. If you enjoy the intro music, we invite you to listen to our debut EP, Honeymoon, streaming now on all platforms. Visit www.moonray-music.com for more.
And we're back. We are talking with Dr. Alejandra Mielke, talking about the power and privilege of microaggressions. Now, before the break, you had shared a couple of the forms of microaggressions. So it seems like there are different styles, I guess is the right word, of a microaggression.
Yes, microaggressions, we have categorized them in different types of microaggressions. We talk about microassaults when we are talking about more intentional discriminatory behavior towards a person who is member of a specific racial group. And these are more open, more direct. And this is what we know as old-fashioned racism, like when it's very clear that there is intention of sending a message, I don't like you, you are not one of us.
The KKK comes immediately to mind.
Exactly. An environmental microassault can be displaying the hood of the Ku Klux Klan, right? That's a very clear message that we believe this and we do not like you or having you around. So that's one type of a microaggression.
A moment ago, you mentioned in the forms of microaggressions, it's verbal, behavioral, and environmental. And you just shared an environmental one. What's a verbal one, I guess, would just be like using a derogatory word. Explicitly,
right?
Okay. What are the other types of microaggressions?
So we also have micro insults, and these are comments or actions that are unintentionally discriminatory. So different to the micro assaults, these are unintentional. There's no real intent of harming others. They are just based on stereotypes or based on what we see certain groups to be or to look like. And they are very insensitive. They communicate a disregard for individuals' identity or heritage, for example. And they're subtle snubs. They convey a hidden message to the recipient. For example, a manager who doesn't call on a female employee during a meeting,
okay.
Right?
Yeah.
So that might not be intentional, but is obviously something is going on in his brain that is not calling on women, that is not allowing him to call on women. So that's a micro insult, and that's some kind of a behavioral micro insult. It's an action. Another example could be someone saying to an Asian American candidate, "Oh, you must be applying for the data analyst position."
An assumption about the type of role that they're usually doing, I guess.
Exactly. So that would be a micro insult, and a comment kind of like, your heritage being Asian American might mean, or to me, it means that you're very good with numbers and math, and that's why you should be a data analyst.
Usually born out of ignorance or bias, unconscious bias. Okay.
And based on stereotypes.
Based on stereotypes.
And the last type of microaggressions are micro-invalidations. And these are comments that ignore, dismiss, undermine the experiences of someone who belongs to an underrepresented community. For example, when we hear someone being told, you're overly sensitive, you should not make a big deal out of that. We cannot say anything in front of you. So all that is denying your existence, denying your experience, right? And that is also very, very hurtful. And yeah, I think it's in this one, in this last one, the micro-invalidations, when we really see the role of power and privilege. Because for a very long time, individuals who are in power are the ones who have been able to describe the reality of people of color. They have been able to tell them who you are, what can you do, how much valuable you are, what is your value, what is your worth. And it is through these micro-invalidations that we continue to create, or that people who commit this, people in power, that they continue to create these realities of these people.
That's a really powerful call out right there about, defining reality, and the people with privilege and power have that ability to define others' realities. So give us a couple examples of the types of messages, the types of realities that we're subtly attempting to say to those on the receiving end of said microaggression.
Exactly, yes. Microaggressions, the thing to keep in mind is that they always have this hidden message. With microassaults, the message is not very hidden, as we said, but in the other instances, there is a hidden message, right? And it can be very, very harmful. For example, if someone, a staff member of color brings up racism with a female supervisor, and the female supervisor says, oh, I totally understand that. As a woman, I face discrimination too, right? So what is the message behind that statement? That your racial experience, your racial life, your racial oppression is no different from my gender oppression. It's the same. It's not as important, or it's like, don't make a big deal out of it, right? That is a hidden message when the person of color is trying to convey something about his or her reality, right? So that's a good example.
Alejandra, as you well know, so many folks experience microaggressions on a monthly, weekly, daily basis. What can folks do when they are the target of a microaggression or a witness to a microaggression?
Rule number 1, take care of yourself, and distinguish between two routes that you can take. You can take care of yourself, self-care, survival, or you can choose to confront the source, right? So there are two different things. Now, a lot of times you do not want to go and confront the source, and it's okay. That's a very important message. If you don't want to say anything at that time, or you don't know exactly what to say, or it caught you by surprise and it left you frozen right there, it's okay. What people who study microaggressions have learned and discovered is that we have things or actions or tools called micro-interventions that they can be used against microaggressions. So, and micro-interventions are words, comments, interpersonal tools, right, to counteract, change, or stop microaggressions. And they can be very powerful. And I can give you some examples.
Please.
So we can use micro-interventions to make the invisible visible. Remember, we talk about these hidden messages? We can just use a sentence, a phrase to make that hidden message visible. So, for example, when a white teacher says to a third-generation Asian American student, oh, you speak excellent English, the student can respond, thank you, I hope so. I was born here. So we make that message of like, you do not belong here, or your English is so good to be part of here, and we kind of make it visible. No, yes, I belong here. I'm an American. I was born here. So that could be one example. And the ones that I really like is the micro interventions that disarm microaggressions, that they instantly stop the message, they communicate the disagreement. And we have a lot of examples, like a simple, I don't agree with what you said. That's not how I view it. And the one that I love, my favorite one, is a simple ouch.
Ouch.
Simple ouch can really create this response like, oh, what did I say that it needed an ouch from you, right? That can be very powerful. Or even a shaking your head in disapproval. All those little actions and those phrases are so powerful in giving the message that what you just said was not right. We can also go and educate the offender, right? We can also engage in dialogue and explain clearly why what was said was offensive, right? So we can also do that.
That seems like the bigger hill to climb sometimes for folks, right? Because how do I, coming from less power and privilege, have the ability to effectively communicate some of that to you when your landscape, your world, the narrative that you've been living under is so different than mine? So you've been giving us a lot of really helpful examples of microaggressions and a lot of great tools to understanding and combating them. I want to ask you to give us some strategies for acknowledging when we ourselves might have committed a microaggression and someone points it out, because I think defensiveness kicks in so quickly with people when we're talking about addressing these really big challenges.
Exactly. And let me tell you one thing. If you receive feedback, you should be very thankful for receiving that feedback, because it takes so much courage from the other person to speak up. And you should consider yourself very lucky that that person cares enough about you that wants to spend time and energy giving you some feedback, because it doesn't happen a lot. It's easier when the person receives a microaggression, for that person, the target, just to turn around and move on, right? And go to other spaces. So if you receive feedback, consider it a gift, because it's very powerful. So if you receive the feedback, and if you receive the feedback, don't make it about you. Again, take a breath, count to 10 if needed, take some time to think, and you might have to turn around, go to the corner, go back to your desk, come back a little bit, just take some time. Don't make it about you. It's not about you. And listen, spend your mental energy listening and trying to understand the speaker's perspective.
Talk to us about some ways that we, as professionals, can keep from committing these microaggressions in the future, while also becoming more aware of the power and privilege dynamics at play, even in our own lives.
We are all leaders, and good leaders are self-aware. Once you are self-aware, you understand so much about you, like you said, your power, your privilege, and your reactions to the world, the way you perceive the world. That's number one. Be self-aware of that. Now, be intentional about learning about others' experience. Always understand that other people are going to have very different realities, and that what is obvious to you is only obvious to you. And that's what I keep saying. It's not obvious to anyone else but to you. So don't think that because it's obvious to you, it's going to be clear and obvious to everyone else. So keep that in mind. And think before you speak.
Classic. How can we, as persons in the world, as professionals in the workplace, start to balance the scales of the haves and the have-nots on the power and privilege conversation?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a good question. And that's a tough one. And I wish we could all work together towards answering this question. a lot of people believe that power is finite, right? That there's only a certain amount of power and that I need more to survive, to succeed.
Like only having a piece of the pie.
Exactly.
But there's only the pie. That's all there is.
That's only is. And I think, and it's the opposite. Power, the more you share power, the more power grows, the more power is present in everybody's life. And when we share that power, when we as a society allow more people to enjoy power and this privilege, it's only going to be good for everyone. It's a ripple effect. It's a ripple effect. If I can do this, the whole world will be better. Because that idea of we have this finite amount and I have to keep as much as I can for me and all this is an idea that is hopefully changing because it has not taken us anywhere.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for that. My goodness. All right. Well, lastly, share some resources for our listeners to continue this really empowering educational journey forward.
Daryl Wing Su is fantastic. But a book that is very easy to read is the book written by Tiffany Jana, and the name of the book is Subtle Acts of Exclusion. That would be a fantastic source to start the journey on studying microaggressions.
Thank you for that. I really appreciate that. And of course, those options will be linked in our show notes. Alejandra, we wrap our show with what we call a Femme fact. And throughout the lifetime of this show, we've talked a lot about women in the history books who, for the most part, have kicked the bucket. Though we always appreciate a rad femme fact about spies and pirates and warrior women, we're going to take a moment today to highlight one of the modern do-gooders of our time. Although an eye patch and a sword might not be her uniform of choice, she is equally as daring. We are talking about Svetlana Tikhanovskaya of Belarus, a stay-at-home mother and former grade school teacher, has become known to her country as the face of political revolution against its long-standing authoritarian leader, Alexander Lukashenko. But let's back it up real quick. As with all national figures who become the faces of a revolution, their passions start somewhere. Svetlana was born in 1982 in Belarusian SSR, or the former Soviet Union, not too far from where the Chernobyl nuclear disaster occurred. Svetlana grew up with a supportive, loving family who did face poverty that was also affecting most of her hometown's residents. Fortunately, Svetlana excelled in school and in studies, which came in handy when she began making annual summer trips over to Ireland for work. So for over a decade, Svetlana spent all of her summer breaks in a small town in Ireland where she worked as a Ukrainian to English translator for the refugees that were fleeing from the Chernobyl disaster over to Ireland. Her host family of 10 years, who she still keeps in close contact with even to this day, described her as being incredibly kind, genuine, and caring. As she eventually saved up enough money from her endeavors to pay for college and went on to study teaching at university in Belarus. After a tenure of teaching, Svetlana married Sergei Tikhanovsky, a famous activist, blogger, and YouTuber. Together, they had 2 children, and she left her career to be a stay-at-home mom. But the stay-at-home mom life was pretty short-lived. Believe it or not, America wasn't the only country biting their nails at a high-stakes presidential election back in 2020. In Belarus, the recent 2020 presidential elections, Svetlana's husband, Sergei, was running as an opposition candidate against the incumbent, Alexander Lukashenko. Lukashenko has held presidential power in Belarus since 1994, which should come as no surprise, given that he's currently heading an authoritarian regime. It also explains his catchy nickname as Europe's last dictator. Anyway, under his regime, the voice of independent media has been silenced. International relations are rocky at best. There are lots of political prisoners and folks who have been disappeared, and I did air quotes there. There is evidence of assassination plans on dissidents. I think you might remember a plane being hijacked by their Air Force recently. That was him too. And let's not forget the hallmark of authoritarianism. Elections are neither free nor fair. And the 2020 elections were no exception. After Sergei announced his intention to rival Lukashenko in the elections, he was arrested 2 days later. In response to her husband's arrest, Svetlana then announced that she'd replace her partner and proceeded to run as Lukashenko's main rival. Together with the assistance of the wife of yet another jailed activist, as well as a third female campaign manager, the trio of women formed a political coalition with Svetlana as the face of the resistance. Now, these heroines have garnered quite a bit of attention from the country's female populace and drew so much support that apparently Svetlana won about 75% of the tallied vote when it came to the elections. Now, unexpected plot twist here, Lukashenko claimed that he won in a landslide, declaring himself as the winner of the 2020 presidential election. As you can imagine, this enraged most of the Belarusian voting population because not only are they way past ready to throw him out of office, they were also really excited by the prospect of Svetlana becoming a president, the likes of which they have never seen before. The largest anti-government protests in Belarus's modern history have ensued over Lukashenko's fraudulent results, and protests have been met, unfortunately, with massive hostility and violence from government authorities. Protesters have been faced with violent assault, harassment, and persecution, and an investigation done by the United Nations Human Rights Office cited over 450 documented cases of torture of detainees, and that doesn't even cover the reports of sexual abuse and rape. Meanwhile, Svetlana has gone into hiding out of concerns for her personal safety and that of her children, and she has since been safely self-exiled in Lithuania. But, there's that saying that, exile never stopped a woman, or maybe there's a phrase like that somewhere out there. Anyway, from a residency in Lithuania, Svetlana has continued to make active strides to remove Lukashenko from office. She's released a series of videos where she's clarified the election results. She's called for sanctions against Belarus and Lukashenko's government, which have been enacted by the EU and most recently by the United States. And she even released a blacklist of government police and soldiers who have been invoked in the violent government crackdown on protests, which has since been dubbed Terokhovsky's List, named after the first officially confirmed death of a protester named Alexander Terokhovsky at the hands of police. Accordingly, Lukashenko is no longer recognized as the president of Belarus by the United States, the United Kingdom, or the EU, but is still regarded as such by nations with similar forms of government, like Russia or China. So all of this to say that your history making might not produce a happy ending every time, and in fact, can sometimes be quite painful. However, as Svetlana has demonstrated and continues to show the world, you don't need lots of fireworks or double rainbows to change people's lives. The outcome of Svetlana's actions and activism might not yet be the ideal she's been hoping for. But I'd like to think that history will record her in a favorable light. And as she clearly still has a lot of fight left in her, we're going to be thinking the best for her and for the country of Belarus. Sometimes it really does just take a woman or three to ensure the best kind of revolutionary chaos. And for that, we are grateful. Alejandra, thank you so much for supporting our episode today with your incredible, incredible expertise and the really empowering messages that you brought with you.
Thank you for having me. We had a great time.
Our pleasure. Now, if you enjoyed this conversation and you have not already subscribed or followed this show, please do so. And, you can even leave us some sort of rating or review or your thoughts. You can send me an email. The email is HERdacity@HERdacity.org. And I will be sure to link that in the show notes because it's a mouthful. So my name is Lorelei, and this was HERdacous. Until next time, go out there and lead some revolutions, big or small. We can all change the world in some powerful way. The end.